Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that's likely top of mind for anyone navigating the joys and, let's be real, the occasional chaos of raising kids, our mindset as parents.
hmm
Specifically, we're digging into some recent research that explores whether we see our parenting abilities as something we're either born with or not, or maybe as a set of skills we can actually, grow and develop.
Exactly. Parenting, as well, many of you know, is this incredible mix of wonderful moments and then times that can really test your limits.
Oh, definitely.
There's a well-known book, All Joy and No Fun, that really hits on this sort of gap between what we expect parenting to be and what it often feels like in reality.
Right. And that's the core of what we're exploring today. How do our fundamental beliefs about our ability to parent, whether we think we're naturally gifted or if it's a journey of learning and improvement, how does that affect how we handle the inevitable challenges and maybe how engaged we feel in our role as parents?
Yeah, precisely. Our goal in this deep dive is really to unpack a fascinating study that looks directly at this. It's called Mindsets of Parenting Ability, Coping with Challenges and Engaging in Parenting by Burnett and a team of researchers published just this year.
Okay.
They conducted 3 different studies involving over 1,000 parents, so
Yeah.
quite a bit of data.
Wow. Okay. So let's get into it then. What exactly do we mean by mindsets in this context?
So at its heart, mindset theory, which has been widely discussed thanks to the work of Carol Dweck, talks about the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset.
Okay.
If you have a fixed mindset, you tend to believe that your abilities and qualities are pretty much set from the start. You either have them or you don't, sort of predetermined.
Right. Like I'm just not a patient person.
Exactly. Whereas a growth mindset, on the other hand, is the belief that you can develop and improve your abilities through, well, effort, learning, and sticking with things when they get tough.
So it's not just about how smart someone thinks they are. That's where I usually hear about it.
That's exactly right. And this is a key point highlighted by researchers like Schroeder. These beliefs aren't universal across the board for a person. You might have a real growth mindset when it comes to, I don't know, learning a new recipe,
Yeah, sure.
but feel like your ability to, say, carry a tune is just something you're stuck with. It's attribute specific.
Interesting. So you can have different mindsets for different skills. Can these mindsets actually shift over time, or are we kind of stuck with them?
Well, research suggests they can shift. While we might naturally lean one way or the other, studies by folks like Heslin Keating and Ashford, and even this current research by Burnett and colleagues, indicate that our experiences and even specific efforts can influence and potentially change these underlying beliefs.
That's hopeful.
It is.
And mindset theory, I know it started in education, mostly with kids and learning, but it's spread to a lot of other areas, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As a recent review by Kyler Mashiki points out, it's been applied to everything from how we deal with stress and build resilience to even understanding, like consumer behavior, why we buy certain things.
Yeah.
That broad relevance is really what makes looking at parenting mindsets so compelling now.
Right. Okay. Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because while we've heard a lot about how parents' beliefs about their children's intelligence can affect the kids, this research flips the script, right? It's about how we see our own parenting abilities.
That's the fresh perspective here. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of the previous work in families has focused on what parents think about their children's potential, their kids' abilities.
Yeah.
This study puts the spotlight squarely on the parents themselves and their beliefs about how capable they are as parents.
Which makes perfect sense because there are definitely these unspoken ideas out there about parenting, like that feeling often directed at mothers, as one writer, Conaboy, has noted, that it should all just come naturally, like some built-in instinct. That sounds exactly like a fixed mindset in action, doesn't it?
Precisely. That societal expectation that you should just know really stands in contrast to the massive popularity of parenting books and classes.
Totally, the whole industry.
Right. Which, at their core, suggests that parenting is a set of skills you can learn and get better at, definitely a growth mindset idea. There was some earlier work by Wadoops on something called meta-parenting mindset, which also touched on this, looking at parents as learners and how that influenced whether they participate in parenting programs.
Okay. And why is it so important to specifically look at mindsets about parenting when we're talking about how people parent? Why not just general mindset?
Well, it seems, based on research in other fields like Costa and Faria looked at this in computer science education, the more specific the mindset is to the actual thing you're studying, the more likely it is to predict actual behaviors and outcomes.
Ah,
So looking at mindsets about being a parent is probably going to tell us more about how people actually parent than just knowing their general beliefs about, say, intelligence or something broader.
got it. Okay, so the researchers wanted to see how these parenting mindsets show up when things aren't, smooth sailing. What did they discover about how parents deal with setbacks?
Right, so studies 1 and 2 specifically looked at this, how parents with different mindsets responded to challenges in parenting. The first study focused on the very specific difficulties that many parents face with online schooling during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, yeah, that was a tough one.
Definitely. And the second study took a broader approach, asking parents to just describe a general parenting challenge they'd faced.
Okay. And what did they find in terms of how optimistic parents were about the future after these challenges?
Across both studies, it was pretty consistent. Parents who had a stronger growth mindset reported feeling more positive about their future success as parents, even after hitting a rough patch. This lines up with some previous research, too, by Becker, Burnett, and Hoyt, which suggests that believing you can improve kind of fuels that sense of optimism, that hope.
That makes intuitive sense, right? If you think you can get better at something, you're probably going to feel more hopeful even when things get tough right now.
Exactly.
What about how they actually coped with those tough times? What actions did they take?
So the studies looked at two main ways people tend to cope. There's active coping, which is about, actively trying to solve the problem or get help.
Proactive stuff.
Yeah, proactive. And then there's avoidant coping, which is more about trying to ignore or evade the problem, kind of denial or distraction. Researchers like Burnett and Zhang, Zhu, and Ho have written quite a bit about these different approaches.
And how did those coping styles link up with their parenting mindsets?
Well, in the first study, the one about online schooling, they found that parents with a growth mindset were more likely to use those active coping strategies and less likely to rely on avoidant coping when faced with those challenges. The second study focused specifically on avoidant coping and, again, found that a growth mindset was associated with less of it.
So less avoidance if you think you can grow.
Pretty much. It's interesting to note, actually, that in the first study, they initially tried to combine active and avoidant coping into one single measure, but statistically, it didn't quite work out.
Huh.
Yeah, the reliability wasn't great, so they ended up looking at them as separate things. But the pattern held for both growth mindset meant more active, less avoidant. So yeah, to put it simply, if you believe you can grow as a parent, you seem more likely to tackle problems head on rather than trying to sweep them under the rug.
Right, so growth-oriented parents are more likely to tackle problems head-on rather than, burying their heads in the sand. Now, parenting isn't just about dealing with the tough stuff. It's also about the day-to-day experience, right? How did these mindsets relate to how engaged parents actually felt?
Right, exactly. Parental engagement, as defined by researchers like Goodall and Montgomery, involves things like actively participating in your child's life, genuinely enjoying being a parent and seeing your role as valuable and important. And it's considered really important for how kids develop, as highlighted by folks like Bempachat and Chernoff and El Nokali and colleagues.
Yes, that makes sense.
And the flip side of engagement, really, is burnout. That feeling of just being exhausted, detached, emotionally distant from your parenting role, as described by Roscoe Reyes in Michelasa.
Which we hear a lot about, too.
We do. And it has pretty negative effects for both parents and children, according to Michelasa and others.
Okay, so what did the study find about the connection between these mindsets and those aspects of everyday parenting, the engagement and the burnout?
Well, the first study found a pretty clear positive link between having a growth mindset and feeling engaged as a parent.
Good news.
Yeah. And, maybe unsurprisingly, a negative link with burnout. Basically, if parents believe their abilities could grow, they tended to report being more involved and less burned out.
Okay.
Then the third study used a slightly different way to measure engagement, something called the Hopes for Parenting Scale by Cole and colleagues, and it also found a positive relationship with growth mindsets.
So consistent findings there, too.
Exactly. It really suggests that believing in your potential to develop as a parent seems to fuel more involvement and enjoyment in the role itself.
So a belief in your ability to develop as a parent seems to fuel more involvement and enjoyment. Now, the study also looked at how these mindsets might lead to these outcomes, right? You mentioned coping before. Was that the link?
Yes, exactly. They used a statistical technique called mediation analysis. The idea is to see if coping strategies act as a kind of middleman or a pathway between having a growth mindset and then experiencing engagement or burnout. Think of it like this. Does believing you can improve as a parent lead you to handle stress in healthier ways? And then does that better stress management lead to you feeling more engaged? Is coping the mechanism?
Okay, I get the chain reaction idea. So what did they find? Did coping mediate the link?
Well, the first studies suggested that having a growth mindset might indirectly lead to greater engagement because those parents were less likely to use avoidant coping.
Ah, so it was through less avoidance.
Right. Less avoidance seemed to be the key pathway there. The second study also found an indirect effect growth mindset was linked indirectly to higher engagement and also lower burnout, again, through the same path of less avoidant coping.
Okay, consistent again.
And the third study really backed this up. It showed a significant indirect positive effect of a growth mindset on engagement, specifically through less avoidant coping. So yeah, it really looks like when parents believe they can grow, they deal with challenges more directly, avoiding less, which in turn helps them stay more engaged and maybe avoid some of that burnout.
It certainly sounds like avoiding problems isn't a great strategy for staying engaged in the long run. Seems kind of obvious when you say it, but the data supports it.
It does seem to be a key insight here. However, the researchers were careful to point out, and this is important because these studies mostly looked at a snapshot in time.
Right, cross-sectional.
Exactly, what's called cross-sectional. We can't definitively say that the mindset causes the coping style, which causes the engagement. Correlation isn't causation, as they say.
Always a caveat.
Always. As researchers like Perlin and McKinnon discuss, we really need more research that follows parents over time, longitudinal studies, to really nail down those cause and effect relationships.
Okay. Now, the study also took a look at what might influence someone's parenting mindset in the first place. Where did these mindsets come from? What did they find in terms of things like demographics or family situations?
Right, this part of the research was more exploratory. They looked at things like the parent's gender, how many kids they had, the age or developmental stage of their children, how old they were when they first became a parent, and their socioeconomic status, SES. Basically, trying to see if any of those background factors correlated with holding a growth or fixed mindset about parenting.
And were there any clear patterns that emerged? Any group more likely to have a growth mindset?
Interestingly, across all three studies, they actually found no significant connections.
Really? None at all?
Nope. None of these demographic or family background factors seem to be related to the parents' mindsets about their parenting abilities.
That's surprising. I might have guessed maybe parents with lots of young kids or those who became parents very young might feel more fixed or maybe more growth-oriented. I don't know. Why do you think that might be the case? Why no link?
Well, the researchers suggest that maybe looking at these broad family characteristics just isn't specific enough. It's possible that what really shapes these mindsets are more individual psychological factors, things like past experiences maybe, the kind of feedback parents have received over time, or even the general messages we get from society about parenting.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, other researchers like Gunderson and Hoyt have explored similar ideas in different contexts, looking at those more psychological drivers. So maybe it's less about who you are demographically and more about your personal history or beliefs.
That makes sense. The studies themselves had some slight differences in how they were set up, right? Were there any important variations?
Yes, just minor things, really. For example, the second study focused only on the questions in their survey that were phrased in a fixed mindset way, like, you are a certain kind of parent, and there's not much you can do to really change that.
Okay, why only those?
Well, the thinking there, drawing on Carol Dweck's work, is that these kinds of fixed-phrase statements might be less likely to be influenced by people wanting to present themselves in a socially desirable light. It's maybe harder to agree with a fixed statement if you want to seem flexible.
Interesting tactic.
Yeah. And the third study also used that slightly different measure for parental engagement we mentioned earlier, the Hopes for Parenting scale. Just small tweaks between the studies.
And what about the quality of the information they got? Especially with online surveys, sometimes people just click through, right?
That's a really important point in today's research, definitely. In the third study, they were quite careful about this. They included several checks to try and make sure people were actually reading the questions and giving thoughtful answers, things like attention checks and looking at open-ended responses.
Good. Did it make a difference?
Well, their analysis suggested that some of the findings might have been slightly stronger, slightly inflated, if there hadn't been some of those lower quality responses filtered out or accounted for. So yeah, data quality is always something to keep in mind when looking at these kinds of results.
Right. Good to know they checked. Okay, so when we put all three studies together, what's the main picture that comes into focus? What were the findings that showed up most consistently across the board?
Yeah, so to get a better overall view, the researchers did what they called an internal mini meta-analysis. It's basically a way of statistically combining the results from their three studies
Yeah.
to see the average effect.
Okay, what did that show?
They found really consistent patterns. First, a significant negative relationship between having a growth mindset and using avoidant coping. The more growth-minded, the less avoidant coping. That was a moderate-sized effect, statistically speaking. They also found a significant positive relationship between having a growth mindset and feeling engaged as a parent. Again, growth mindset linked to more engagement. This was also significant, though maybe a slightly smaller effect than the coping one.
Still meaningful, though.
Oh, definitely.
Hmm.
And finally, they found that when parents used avoidant coping, they tended to be less engaged in parenting. That was actually a fairly strong negative relationship. Avoidance and engagement didn't really go together.
Okay, so boiling it down, believing you can grow as a parent links to tackling problems more directly and enjoying the ride more.
That's a great summary, yeah.
Mm.
And the data seems to back that up with some pretty significant links across these studies.
And how strong are those connections, those effect sizes you mentioned, in the grand scheme of things, like in social science research?
Right, context is important.
Mhm.
According to established guidelines, those effect sizes, the correlations they found, are generally considered to be in the medium, maybe even touching on the large range for some, like the link between avoidance and engagement. So while they might not be, astronomical, they're definitely meaningful findings compared to what researchers often see in social psychology and personality research. They suggest these mindset links are pretty robust.
So it really seems like this idea of having a growth mindset about your parenting ability has some real weight to it, some practical implications maybe, but like all research, it also has its limitations, right? What should we keep in mind?
Absolutely. The biggest one, as we touched on earlier, is that these studies are primarily correlational.
Right.
We can see that certain mindsets and behaviors tend to go together,
Right.
but we can't definitively say from this data alone that having a growth mindset causes better coping or engagement. It could be the other way around, or something else entirely could be influencing both.
Gotcha.
So future research that uses experiments, maybe interventions designed to shift mindsets, as suggested by Burnett and also by Yeager and Dweck in other contexts, will be really important for figuring out those cause and effect relationships, and also for seeing if we can actually help parents develop more of a growth mindset if they want to.
That would be the next logical step, wouldn't it? What other areas for future research did the study authors point out? Where should the research go next?
They emphasize the need to dig deeper into how these mindsets actually lead to these outcomes. The why behind the link. For example, work by Dweck and Yeager points to the role of effort beliefs. Do parents with a growth mindset simply believe that putting in more effort will lead to improvement, and that's why they engage more? Understanding those mechanisms is key.
Mm-hmm.
The study authors also suggested looking at mindsets in more specific areas of parenting. The study looked at general parenting ability.
Right.
But what about mindsets about specific skills, like, say, communication or setting boundaries? In fact, they mentioned that they're currently working on research specifically about parents' mindsets when it comes to having difficult conversations with teenagers.
Ooh, that's a really interesting one.
Isn't it the idea that you could feel like you can generally improve as a parent overall, but feel less confident, maybe more fixed, in your ability to handle, say, disagreements with your teen about screen time or something?
Yeah, I can see that.
They also suggested borrowing ideas from research on leadership and coaching mindsets and applying them to parenting. Like, how do parents signal their own belief in growth to their children? That's a fascinating question. And maybe even, what are parents' beliefs about their children's potential to grow and change? That could be a whole other layer.
Wow. Yeah, lots of avenues there. Anything else?
A couple of other important points. They noted that their study mainly involved parents in the United States, so doing more research in different cultures is really important to see how universal these findings are.
That's a point.
And getting perspectives from multiple people in the family, maybe the spouse or partner or even the child, where appropriate could give a richer picture than just relying on the parent's own report. Which leads to the final point. They acknowledged that they mostly relied on parents reporting on their own experiences, self-report measures. Future research could benefit from also including, perhaps, observations of actual parenting behaviors or maybe other ways to assess coping beyond just surveys. They also want to explore different ways of understanding how parents respond to those setbacks.
Okay. Lots to consider for future research then. So, to kind of bring it all together, what's the main takeaway for you, our listener, from this deep dive into parenting mindsets?
I think the most significant takeaway, really, is that having a growth mindset about your ability to parent, genuinely believing that you can develop and improve your skills over time, seems to be pretty consistently connected to coping better with the inevitable challenges of raising children,
Hmm.
and also to feeling more engaged, more involved, and maybe more fulfilled in your role as a parent.
And while this research gives us some really valuable initial insights, it sounds like it's really just the start of understanding this whole picture, isn't it? There's still a lot to learn.
Absolutely. We definitely need more research to fully understand how these mindsets develop in the first place, how stable they are over a lifetime, and maybe most importantly, from a practical standpoint, how we might be able to encourage a growth mindset in parents to support both their own well-being and ultimately their children's development too.
Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive, really fascinating stuff. And for you, our listener, I want to leave you with this thought. Take a moment to consider your own beliefs about your parenting abilities. Do you tend to see them as something you're sort of born with, relatively fixed, or as something you can continually learn and develop? And just ponder, how might this perspective influence how you navigate the everyday ups and downs of raising children and maybe your overall enjoyment of the journey? It's definitely something worth mulling over. And hey, there are many resources out there on growth mindset if you'd like to explore it further. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.